It's a Monday morning in 1956 on the 16th floor of a building on Madison Avenue, and a man named Robert is standing in the elevator. He is 28 years old. His suit is gray. His hat is a Dobbs. His shoes were polished last night on a piece of newspaper spread across the kitchen floor, a task his father did before him and his father before that. In his breast pocket is a folded handkerchief he will not use. On his wrist is a watch his father-in-law gave him at the wedding. In his briefcase is a manila folder he brought home Friday and didn't open. The elevator dings. The doors open. Robert steps out into the office and the workday begins. If you've ever worn a hat you didn't choose or swallowed something you weren't allowed to say, this list is for you. Subscribe if you want the rest of the story, because this is a countdown of 12 of those rules, and the one at number 1 is the one almost no working man in 1950s America ever thought to question. For most of the 1950s, men who worked in America's offices, banks, factories, and sales floors lived under a code. Some of it was written. Most of it wasn't. All of it was real. These were not the rules of a cage. Most of them were rungs on a ladder, and most men climbed. But rungs have edges, and the men who slipped on them found out quickly. We'll start with the visible ones. The hat, the handshake, the 2-drink limit at the client dinner. And we'll end on the rule almost no working man in 1950s America could see, because it was built into the floor he was standing on. Let's begin. Number 12. The hat is worn correctly. A man who arrived at the office hatless in 1956 was not making a fashion statement. He was making a class statement, and not the kind that helped him. The hat was a Dobbs or a Stetson or whatever the men 2 floors above him were wearing, and it sat at a specific angle that every man learned by watching other men and never by being told. It came off in the elevator. It came off when a woman entered a room. It came off in the presence of a casket. A man who kept it on in any of these situations was not ignorant of the rule. He simply didn't care about the job. The hat disappeared in the early 1960s when John Kennedy showed up to his inauguration without one. But in 1956, it was as mandatory as the briefcase and considerably less forgiving. Number 11. The suit, not the sport coat. There was a suit for the office and a sport coat for the weekend. A man who confused them was a man who didn't understand where he was. The office suit was dark, navy, charcoal, or the gray that Robert was wearing in the elevator. The lapels were narrow. The trouser break was precise. A man who wore brown shoes with a navy suit on a Tuesday at the office had already lost something he couldn't name, but his supervisor had already measured. None of this was written anywhere. It was transmitted by proximity, by watching the men who got promoted and copying what they wore. The working uniform of the American male office worker in 1956 was designed to communicate one thing: I am interchangeable with the man next to me, and I know it, and I am fine with it. That was not a coincidence. Number 10. The handshake. The handshake in 1956 was a diagnostic. It told the other man everything he needed to know in the first 3 seconds. Whether you were confident or anxious, whether you'd been coached or raised well, whether you belonged in the room or had just found your way in. Too limp and you were weak. Too aggressive and you were trying too hard. Too fast and you were nervous. The right handshake was firm, brief, and dry. A man who sweated through his palm before a client meeting kept a handkerchief in his right jacket pocket and used it before he extended his hand. No one taught this in any management handbook. It was passed from father to son in living rooms across America. If your father hadn't taught you, you had to figure it out from the reaction of the first man whose hand you'd shaken wrong. Number 9. 2 drinks at the client dinner. The 3-martini lunch was real. The expense account was real. The expected drinking was real. What was also real, and far less discussed, was the ceiling. A man could drink with a client. He was expected to. The man who ordered club soda at a steakhouse dinner while the client had a scotch was leaving money on the table, or at least that was the belief. But there was a number past which a man became a liability. And every working man in 1956 knew that number roughly and spent his career staying slightly below it. 2 was the rule most men operated by. 2 with dinner, 1 at the bar after if required. The man who had 3 had better not show it. The man who had 4 was not getting the account. The man who had 5 would be retelling the story at a worse company 6 months later. Number 8. You did not discuss salary. A man's salary was his own business and no one else's, and the moment he mentioned a number to a colleague, he had introduced a variable into a system that had been carefully calibrated to keep him from knowing what anyone else made. This rule was enforced entirely by social embarrassment. There was no policy against it. There was only the collective understanding that a man who talked about money was a man who didn't have enough of it. The men who made the most talked about it the least. The men who made the least were most motivated to keep silent. The system worked perfectly. Number 7. You did not cry. Not at the desk, not in the hallway, not after the dressing down in the boss's office, not after the account that fell through, not after the promotion that went to someone else, and you found out about it second. A man who showed emotion at the office in 1956 had done something that could not be undone. There was no written rule against it. There was only the way the room changed and the way it didn't quite change back. The rule did not distinguish between grief and frustration and humiliation, and the particular hollow feeling of being 28 years old and standing in an elevator in a gray suit, wondering if you had made the right choices. All of it went into the same internal drawer where the handkerchief was, and stayed there. Number 6. You were the one who provided. By 1956, the American economy had produced something it had never produced before. A working class that could reasonably expect to own a house, a car, a television, and a refrigerator on one income. The culture had named who that income came from. The working man who made less than his wife had a problem that his co-workers would quietly identify, and his boss would factor it into decisions about him. The working man who couldn't support a family was not quite a working man in the fullest sense of the word, not by the measure the culture applied. This wasn't law. It wasn't policy. It was the expectation that sat underneath every performance review, every salary negotiation, every question about where he saw himself in 5 years. A man without dependence was a man without stakes. A man without stakes was a man without the right kind of motivation. The expectation shaped the math before he even sat down at the table. Number 5. You deferred upward and expected deference downward. The hierarchy in a 1956 American office was explicit in a way that would become uncomfortable to acknowledge 20 years later. The men above you called you by your first name. You called them Mr. A junior man who called a senior man by his first name without being invited to had committed an offense with no name but real consequences. A senior man who was not called Mr. by his subordinates was one whose authority was being tested. The entire system ran on this asymmetry, and everyone in it knew exactly where they stood, which was the point. The deference moved upward through the male hierarchy and reached the top, where it stopped. Below the bottom of that hierarchy was a separate hierarchy of women who deferred to it all. Number 4. The performance review you never asked for. A man did not ask his boss how he was doing. He waited to be told. To ask was to reveal uncertainty. To reveal uncertainty was to confirm it. A man who needed to be told he was doing well was a man who didn't already know, and a man who didn't already know was a man who might not be. So they waited, and the reviews came once a year in a closed office, lasted 20 minutes, and were delivered in the specific language of corporate evaluation that a man learned to translate over time. A solid contributor meant average. Room to grow meant you had not grown. Leadership potential meant not yet. A man learned the vocabulary, adjusted his ambitions accordingly, went back to his desk, and did not ask again. Number 3. You did not change industries. A man who had been in insurance for 6 years did not become a man in advertising. A man who had worked in a bank did not become a man who worked in a department store. The lateral move in 1956 was read as a failure of nerve or a failure of performance, and it was rarely read as anything else. Stability was the credential. The man with 12 years at one company was more hireable at 40 than the man with 6 companies in 12 years. The loyalty was to the institution. The institution, for its part, was not bound by the same rule in the same direction, but that asymmetry was not something a man in a gray suit on a Monday morning was encouraged to examine too closely. Number 2. The provider's math always ran. A man in 1956 could earn. He could climb. He could get the promotion, the corner office, and the title with the word senior in front of it. What he could not do was stop. Retirement was 65 and compulsory in most companies. Social Security existed and was not enough. The pension, if it existed, required 20 or 25 years of continuous employment at one firm to vest fully. A man who left before it vested left empty-handed. A man who was let go before it vested had the same result. The math ran in the background of every decision. How much longer until the pension locks? How much until the mortgage is paid? How much until the children are through school? How much until the clock stops? The man who went home at 6 every night, kissed his wife, watched Gunsmoke, and got up and did it again was not simply a man who loved his family. He was a man running a calculation. He had no choice but to keep running. Number 1. The assumption was that this was freedom. Whatever job a man worked in 1956, executive, salesman, clerk, factory foreman, the assumption underneath it was that the choice had been his. He had picked the company. He had climbed the ladder. He had provided and deferred and worn the hat, and kept the salary private, and swallowed what he felt, and done it again the next day. And unlike Margaret in the elevator, no one would tell him at 32 that his useful years were behind him. No one would weigh him before the meeting. No one would ask him to step on a scale. No one would change his nameplate the Monday after his wedding. The rules Robert followed were real. The pressure was real. The performance was real. The weight of the provider expectation, the emotional lockbox, and the 25-year clock running toward the pension, all of it was real. But Robert also got the job that Margaret was not offered. Robert also got the promotion Margaret had earned. Robert's work was a career. Margaret's work was an interval. And the rules Robert followed were the architecture of a system that was, in the end, built for him. He just never had to look at the blueprints. So which of these were law, which were policy, and which were simply what everyone did? The dress codes, the deference structures, the salary silence. Custom, never written, enforced by proximity. The provider expectation, the pension clock, the lateral move penalty. Structural, built into the economics so deeply that no one needed to say them out loud. And the assumption at number 1, that the whole arrangement was a man's natural inheritance, rather than a set of rules with edges and costs. That was the most powerful rule of all because it was the one he was least likely to question. Robert, in the elevator on a Monday morning in 1956, was following all of them at once. He knew which were written and which were not. He knew, walking out of that elevator, exactly the rules of the world he was walking into. He had his hat and his handshake and a gray suit, and a Monday morning and a calculation he would keep running for the next 37 years. And he never once called it a rule. If this brought back a memory, a performance review in a closed office, a handshake someone taught you, a number you were never supposed to say out loud, hit subscribe. There's more forgotten, honest history like this waiting for you. And the next story is ready when you are.